So welcome to the next episode of Network Security. In the previous video, we've seen situations where the attacker and the victim are in the same local area network. So the attacker has visibility of whatever is being transmitted. And now we're going to consider a situation where attackers and victims are in separate networks. So the attacker is trying to attack from across the internet. They're remote. For instance, what we see in blind IP spoof, where the attacker sends a packet to a victim with a spoofed IP address. So you simply craft a datagram with the IP address of another host, maybe a host with which the victim has a trust relationship. And you can simply do that. IP doesn't stop you from doing this. You can just add another source IP address in your packet. But of course, the complication arises when the victim replies, and it will only reply to the machine of which you've spoofed the IP address, and you have no visibility of this, right? The attacker has no visibility of the communication that takes place here, unlike in the situation where we have local presence. Okay, and this creates all sorts of problems, for instance, when we talk about UDP. But in principle, we can do this. And in some attacks, that's roughly what we're doing. For instance, when we do spoofing at the UDP layer, rather than TCP, TCP is way more complicated. But at the UDP layer, it's exactly this. We simply craft a packet with a forwarded IP address, and we send it to a server, and the server will simply reply to the client here, of which we've spoofed the IP address. It's very easy attack to perform. Now, UDP is extremely simple, but it's still a very important protocol in practice. So some of the core services that are at the heart of the internet, such as DNS, work with UDP. Okay. There are also other protocols such as NFS servers and NIST servers, a little bit older, not used that much anymore. They also work with UDP. And besides spoofing, we can do similar attacks that we saw earlier, such as hijacking, where we have a client that sends a request to a server, and the attacker is able to also receive or see this request and reply by racing with the server, reply before the server does, and poison the information that's received by the client. So this is, for instance, possible if the attacker is in the same local area network as the server, or is in the same local area network as the client. Okay. Or in some cases, and we'll see examples of that, if the attacker is able to prompt the requests that are being sent by the client. Okay. Or in a very extreme case where the attacker is the client, and you still want to do this to poison some other intermediate server. As you know, we'll see examples of that also at a later stage. At any rate, UDP makes all of this really simple in principle. And the example that we're going to look at is DNS, because the other ones are a little bit older and a little less relevant. But DNS is one of the core services in the internet, super critical for security. And DNS, if you all remember from your computer networks course, allows you to map a symbolic name such as gaia.cs.umass.edu into an IP address. And it has two modes of operation. We can do this recursively, and in this case, we send a DNS query to our local name server, and the local name server will then handle the query for us. It will send it to, say, the root domain name server, which will say, I actually don't know the IP address of this symbolic name, but let me ask the top-level domain name server of the .edu domain, and the top-level domain name server will also reply, hey, I don't actually know the IP address of that IP address, but let me ask the authoritative name server here, and that finally actually knows the mapping. It knows the IP address for this machine, sends it back to the top-level domain name server, which sends it back to the root domain name server, which sends it back to the local domain name server, and the local domain name server says, first of all, let me cache this entry so that if there's a subsequent lookup for that same symbolic name, I actually can provide the IP address directly and reply to the requesting host. Okay, that's one way of operating. That's the recursive DNS query. But in practice, what we often see is that DNS queries are handled iteratively. in this case, the procedure is not that different. We ask our local name server to resolve this symbolic name. The local name server contacts, say, the root name server, and the root name server says, I don't know, right? I don't know the IP address for that symbolic name, but rather than asking the top-level domain name server itself, it will reply with the IP address of the top-level domain name server so that the local name server can contact the top-level domain name server, and the top-level domain name server will then also reply by saying, I don't know the IP address of the symbolic name that you're looking for, but here's the IP address of the DNS server of the computer science department at the University of Massachusetts. Okay, and these pictures, by the way, have been taken from the excellent book by Kuros and Ross on computer networks. Okay, and then finally, we actually have the answer in the local domain name server, and the local domain name server will again store this in its cache and finally reply to the requesting host. Now, some remarks. All of these interactions, all of these packets are UDP packets. Second remark, often the local name server does not contact the root name server, but talks to the top-level domain name server directly. Why? Most of the top-level domain names are already cached in the local name server. So that means that the local name server knows the IP address of the top-level domain name server already for the .edu domain. So it doesn't have to go to the root name server. Okay, and finally, there are these two modes of operation, but very often we find the iterative mode is used in practice, and we shall see an example of that in a minute. So even if you request, if your local name server requests to do a recursive lookup, the root name server or the top-level domain name server may actually refuse and modify that into an iterative query. All right, so all of this is UDP. So what can we do in terms of spoofing? And what we're going to do is we're going to start with an extremely simple DNS spoofing attack and then gradually make this more interesting, more advanced. And the really simple DNS spoofing attacks concern situations where a very weak form of authentication is used. So what it tries to do is it will use DNS for authentication. So it will do a reverse lookup to determine whether or not the requesting client has certain privileges. Okay, for instance, a server may use this for determining whether a client is able to log in without username and password. So what it will do is it will only trust a client if it has the right domain name. So it will only trust, say, a client that is called trusted.example.nl. Okay, so it receives an IP packet from the internet, and the first thing it will do is it will look up this IP address. So in DNS, you can map symbolic names into IP addresses, but you can also map IP addresses into symbolic names, and that's called a reverse lookup. So what it will do is it will do a reverse lookup for this IP address and see if it maps to trustedexample.nl, and only in that case it will allow the login. Okay. So what we're now going to do is make use of this lookup and the fact that the lookup may end up in an authoritative name server that is controlled by the attacker. And rather than explaining this with many words, let's just simply have a look at an example graphically illustrated here. So on the left, we have an attacker which has a host C with a particular IP address. Okay, this particular IP address. And it wants to attack a victim host A with this IP address. And the way that works is it tries to set up a TCP connection, or maybe it could be a UDP interaction, but it doesn't matter so much. It tries to log in this into this machine. Now, this host is protected with this weak form of authentication, And what it will do is it'll say, I've received a packet from this IP address here, 128.132.10. I want to know if this is indeed trusted example.nl, which is the machine that I trust. Okay, so what it will do is it will do a lookup, a reverse lookup in the domain name system, asking it to resolve the IP address. Okay, and it does that by means of its local name server. And the local name server will say, well, 128.132.10, never heard of this, but I know the domain name system. I will look this up for you. Okay. So, and to do this, it will send queries into the hierarchical domain name systems, right? Talking to various name servers along the way. And eventually that hierarchy will, percolate down again to the authoritative name server, which happens to be a name server that the attacker controls. This is the attacker's domain. So the attacker has his own or her own name server. Okay, and so the request that arrives at the name server is, what is the domain name for 128.132.10? And the name server that the attacker controls can reply anything. So it replies trusted example.net. And this is what the local name server replies to the victim. And the victim will say, well, if it's trusted example.nl, I can allow the login incorrectly. Okay. And this is a really simple attack. It's also a really simple and weak, faulty authentication scheme. You shouldn't use that. But it's also really easy to fix, even with the components that were sketched on the previous slide. We don't have need for any additional technology. You can just use the DNS system to fix this again. And maybe you want to pause the video at this stage and think about how you could do this. Okay, it's not a very complicated answer. And it starts with exactly the same way. The name server resolves 128.130.2.10, the attacker's IP address, and receives a reply from the attacker with a symbolic name that matches, but that it cannot trust, right? Because the attacker can provide anything. So what can the attacker do? Sorry, what can the local name server do, or the host do, to verify this? Well, it can do a double lookup. Okay, so if it cannot automatically trust this symbolic name to be the symbolic name that corresponds to this IP address, what it can do is simply do another lookup for this symbolic name. Okay, so it does another lookup, goes into the domain name system, and receives a reply for this symbolic name, which happens to be a completely different IP address than the IP address of the attacker. And it notices that this is not the same, and it notices that something is wrong. Okay, and the attacker doesn't control this, right? It cannot control trusted example.nl. It doesn't have the name server of trusted example. Okay, so the attack is thwarted. But still, this is a weak authentication scheme. And what we're going to do now is look at slightly more advanced DNS spoofing. Okay. And specifically, what we want to do is we want to poison entries in an intermediate name server. So what we want to do is have, say, our local name server contain a mapping that is wrong. So, maybe a mapping for google.com, which is really pointing to an IP address that is corresponding to the machine owned by the attacker. Right, so that anybody who does a lookup for this and then wants to contact the machine will really contact the attacker's machine. Okay, so to do this, let's first look at what a DNS query looks like. A DNS query on the wire contains an IP header here, a UDP header, and then the UDP payload or the DNS data. Okay. I don't want to say too much about the IP header. We should all know IP headers, but it contains at the very least a source IP address and a destination IP address. The UDP header, not very interesting either. It contains a source port and a destination port. And I just want to say about this that the destination port, if we're talking about DNS, the destination port is 53. So the DNS servers, the name servers, listen on port 53, UDP port 53. And what I want to say about the DNS data for now, and we'll look at the other fields later, is that all the queries have a so-called query ID, a unique ID. Okay, and the query ID is very important because if you send out a query, and maybe you're sending, as a local name server, you're sending out many queries, right? Maybe to multiple top-level domain name servers, and then you sit waiting for replies. A reply comes in with a query ID. Okay, the reply also has a query ID, and the query ID has to match. So you know what reply this is by matching it with the query ID of the request. Okay, so there has to be a match between the reply and the response in terms of the query ID, and that's important. Okay. And like I said, what we want to do is poison one of the intermediate name servers. For instance, this one, we want to have a mapping there that says that this machine, this legitimate machine that really lives at University of Massachusetts, really points to some evil address owned by Herbert. Okay, and that to do that, what we'll have to do is, well, this machine is going to send out a request for gaia.cs.umass.edu. And this is me, right? I'm going to send out this request. The attacker is going to send out this request for gaia.cs.umass.edu. And after that, it knows that this local name server will contact maybe the root name server or the top-level domain name server, okay, to provide an answer to the query. So what the attacker will do is it will try to send a reply pretending to be the root name server or the top-level domain name server, depending on which one it contacts. Okay, so it will send a spoofed reply that hopefully the local name server will attack, but it will accept. But it will only accept it if the query ID matches. Okay? So the reply ID has to match this query ID. And that's a little unfortunate because it's a 16-bit number. Okay, so getting that right is perhaps not easy. Well, it used to be really easy in the past, to be honest. It was just a number that was incremented sequentially, so it's really simple to guess, trivial to guess. Okay, what you would have to do is send a reply to the local name server pretending to be the next name server and provide the right query ID, but the wrong mapping from this symbolic name to an IP address, and you would be done. Okay, but nowadays this query ID is a random 16-bit number. In fact, it's a little bit more complicated, as we'll get to in a little while. But a 16-bit number, that is much harder to guess correctly, right? So if you send a query to your name server and guess a query ID for the reply, the probability of you guessing this correctly is 1 over 2 to the power 16. In other words, 1 over 65,000. Okay, but those odds are not very good. Okay, so instead, what we're going to make use of is what is known as the birthday phenomenon. We call this a DNS birthday attack. And the birthday phenomenon is a really well-known phenomenon. If you have a group of people, say a classroom full of people, you only need roughly 23 people in order to get 2 people to have the same birthday. The probability of 2 people having the same birthday above 50%. Okay, so in other words, even with a relatively modest group of people, the probability of 2 people matching in birthday, in this particular case, is very high. And the reason for that is that we're not matching, we're not saying the probability of somebody having the same birthday as me, right? So if it's a group of 23 and we're looking for someone having the same birthday as me, okay, that's a different story. What we're interested now is doing a many-to-many comparison. And as long as there's one pair that matches, that's fine. Okay, so that makes the problem much more scalable. Okay, to illustrate this, if we do conventional spoofing, right, we send a request to a name server for a symbolic name, and then we send replies, spoofed replies, pretending to be the next name server providing the reply. The probability of us guessing the name, the query ID correctly is very small, right? So if we send 10 replies, the probability of us getting the right query ID is only 10 over 65,000. Okay? That's not good. If we send 100, it's still only 100 over 65,000. If we send 1,000, it's still only 1,000 over 65,000 and a bit. Okay, so that's not great. If we do this with a birthday attack, where we send not n replies for every request, but we send n requests and then n replies, right? Then our probability is much better. And the formula here shows it, but we'll show it graphically in a minute. And now the probability is much better. So let me just first illustrate what we're going to do. We're going to send not one request to the name server, we're going to send many requests to the name server, all trying to resolve the same domain name. Okay, that means that there are lots of requests being sent to the next name server. That's the assumption, that it will actually send a lot of requests to the next name server. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to also send lots of replies, okay, for that query. Okay, and so now what we have is a many-to-many comparison, as long as with many guesses for the query ID, and as long as there's one match between the many queries that are being sent out and the many replies that we provide, we're done, right? That's all we need. One match is all we need. And that means that the name server, the local name server, will now have a mapping for the symbolic name that is incorrect, that's pointing to a false IP address. Okay, and we can do this for any name server, but we've taken the local name server as an example. Okay, and how much better is this? Well, it's much better. In the case where we do conventional spoofing, right? So where we do a single request and then send lots of replies, hopefully getting the query ID correctly. Well, even if we send 2,000 replies, the probability of us getting the query ID correctly is not even 5%, right? It's I don't know, is it 3-4% or so? It's much less than what we would like to have a successful attack. So we'd have to send lots of replies. So even if we send 30,000 replies, the probability of us getting it correctly is still less than 50%. In contrast, if we use this birthday phenomenon, we only have to send a few hundred packets, a few hundred requests and replies to get the probability up to 50%. And if we want to get a probability of over 90%, we still only need a few hundred requests and replies. Okay, so that scales much, much better. Now, this is one way to speed things up, but it only gets us a poisoned mapping for a particular symbolic name. What we're going to do next is see if we can escalate this. And I want to remind you that this is not the only way in which you can attack this. So birthday attacks are very powerful, but we may also simply use the limited randomness if the implementation of the randomness is not very good. But we'll save that for a later lecture. Okay. First, I want to go beyond this poisoning of the single symbolic name with a single IP address. Okay, and this is what I'm going to discuss next is something that is known as Kaminsky's attack, and it caused a huge panic in the internet a couple of years ago. Okay, and you can see why, because it's a much more devastating attack than what we've discussed so far, because it allows the attacker not to poison a single entry, right? So this particular server will now point, the symbolic name will now point to some IP address that is controlled by the attacker. No, it allows an attacker to control an entire domain, so that all the communication going to, I don't know, bankofamerica.com will be controlled by the attacker. The attacker can determine that anybody who wants to communicate with bankofamerica.com will actually talk to the attacker's computers. And that is kind of crazy. And to see how that works, we'll have another look at the DNS queries. And what we've said so far is that most DNS queries, even if you try to do a recursive query, it gets demoted to an iterated query. And what we want to make use of is that we again do the spoofing and poison an entry, for instance, in a local name server, but now for an entire domain. And to understand the details, we have to look at the DNS packets in more detail, what they look like on the wire. Okay, so here's the DNS query. Again, we have an IP header which contains the IP address of the sender, say the local name server, and it has the IP address of a top-level domain name server. So we want to look up the IP address of, say, this symbolic name, www.unixwiz.net. Example taken from the internet. Okay, and our local name server contacts not the root name server, but it contacts the top-level domain name server for the .net domain, and it will ask it for a mapping for this particular domain name, so the IP address for this particular domain name. Okay, so it sends it to UDP port 53, and we already saw that UDP port 53 is the port on which the name server listens. The UDP port on which the name server listens. And then we get to the DNS packet. And the DNS packet, as we already mentioned, has a unique query ID for this query. And the query is indeed a query. So it's a local name server trying to get something resolved rather than a reply. Okay, it's a standard query, and the local name server tells the top-level domain name server that it would like to have this query resolved recursively. Okay. And which query are we talking about? Well, there's one question in this entire packet, and the question is, what is the A record? In other words, what is the mapping to an IP address for www.unixwiz.net? And this is received by this machine, so 192.26.92.30 here, and that replies, right? So here the source IP and destination IP addresses are switched. It replies to our local name server coming from port 53. It replies with a query, so with a DNS packet that has the same query ID, right? So the query ID of the reply matches the query ID of the request. Okay, and it tells the local name server that this is indeed a response. It's not an authoritative response. It doesn't have the IP address of that machine that we were looking for. And it also tells the local name server that yes, you may have wanted a recursive resolution, but we're not going to do that, right? So I'm just going to tell you how it is. It's going to be an iterative query. Okay, and what is in the reply? Well, the reply doesn't have the mapping to an IP address of the domain that we were looking for, www.unixwiz.net. It actually repeats the question, but it does contain some other answers. What it does contain is what the name servers are for this domain, for the unixwiz.net domain. So it tells the local name server that the name servers for unixwiz.net name server is either linux.unixwiz.net or cs.unixwiz.net. Okay. So those are the two name servers for that domain. Now, if we just receive this, we would have to still resolve these particular symbolic names to get their IP addresses which requires another name lookup. So to make this a little bit more performant, to make this faster, more efficient, the top-level domain name server is friendly, and it provides us those IP addresses already. So it gives us the IP addresses of the name server, the first name server of the unixwiz.net domain, and of the second name server of the unixwiz.net domain. So these are so-called glue records. The glue records provide the IP addresses for these name servers. Okay, that's very friendly. Okay, now these glue records are what we're going to use in our attack. Okay. Anyway, so let's finish the example. What we now do is we're going to contact one of these name servers for unixwiz.net. In this particular case, we've contacted unixwiz.net. This is a new query, so it has a new query ID. It would be a random number, so it wouldn't be just the next one. But anyway, it's a different number than the one that we saw earlier. It's again a request, and we ask again recursion, and we want to know the mapping still of unixwiz.net. Okay, so this name server, Linux unixwiz.net, so port 53 again, it replies, and it replies with the same query ID, and it indicates that this is a response, and it doesn't do recursion. But look at this, it's an authoritative response, and it actually has the answer. It has the answer saying that www.unixwiz.net, in other words, a symbolic name that we were looking for, is at this IP address. Okay, that is great. So now we're happy, and everything is hunky-dory. We can, our local name server can store this mapping in its cache, and it can provide it to the requesting host. How can we use this as an attacker? Well, what we will do as an attacker is we will send a request query for some random name within the target domain that we want to own. Okay, for instance, if we want to attack bankofamerica.com, we will send some random string .bankofamerica.com. If we want to take over bankofsteve.com, right? So let's assume this is a real domain. We send a request for, I don't know, www.1234567 .bankofsteve.com, something that probably doesn't exist, right? And probably certainly doesn't exist in the cache of the local name server. Okay, and then we also reply with a stream of forged DNS responses. Okay, and with the hope of having a match with the query ID. For instance, we could forge the replies coming from the root name server or the top-level domain name server, or maybe even the name server of bankofsteve.com. Okay, but we also have to get that query ID right, so the 16-bit number, which we could do in different ways. Maybe we could again use a birthday attack, but let's not go there now. Assuming that we get the query ID correctly, that this is not the problem, we reply not with the IP address of the domain we were looking for, not this one, but instead we're going to reply just like in the previous example. We're going to reply saying we don't know, right? We don't know the IP address of this symbolic name, but we can give you the name servers that you should contact. Okay, and we can even give the correct name servers. So we can even give the names of the real name servers of bankofsteve.com, the domain bankofsteve.com. But what we're going to do in the glue records is provide the wrong IP addresses for those name servers. Okay, so the glue records point the name servers at the attacker's IP addresses. And what that means is that all the subsequent name lookups that are for anything within the bankofsteve.com domain will go to our name servers. And our name servers can provide it with any IP address we want. Right? So and that means that all of those requests for servers in the bankofsteve.com domain are controlled, are owned by the attacker. In other words, we own the entire zone. Okay? The victim will think that we own this domain in question. So let's illustrate this just to make this even clearer. And we're going to start at the bottom. So our bad guy, so this is the attacker, sends out a request for some random string inside the bankofsteve.com domain. Okay? And it sends that to the victim name server. Let's say this is the local name server. Okay, what that will lead to is that the local name server or the victim name server will send out a request, in this particular case, to the root or top level domain name server with a query ID of 1000. And it's asking for the IP address of this symbolic name. At the same time, the attacker is going to, just like in a normal DNS spoofing attack, is going to send a lot of replies. It's going to send a lot of replies for this query, right? And the replies are going to say not what the mapping is of this symbolic name to an IP address, but rather what the name servers are that you should contact in order to get this resolved. Okay? And the hope is that one of the replies matches the query ID of a request. Now, in this particular illustration, it seems that we haven't gone for a match to the request sent to the top level domain name server or root name server, but rather for a match, say it's 1001, a match of a request that is sent to the actual name server of bankofsteve.com. Okay, so fortunately, the attacker managed to get one of these guessed correctly. So there's a query ID 1001, which actually matches this one. And that means that this record will be accepted by the victim name server. And now the victim name server knows or thinks it knows the name server that it should contact. And note, these symbolic names are actually the correct ones, right? So it has ns1.bankofsteve.com, which is really the right symbolic name. The only thing that is not correct is the IP address of these name servers. Okay, here it says that the IP address is 10.9.9.98, where in reality it should be 10.1.1.1, 10.1.1.1, yes. Okay, so all subsequent queries now for anything in bankofsteve.com will look up the query at this name server, which means that the attacker controls where this connection is going to go to, and we own the domain. Now, that's great, and this is not the only kind of attack. There's new attacks. This is still a very active research area. Have a look at some of the other attacks. Also, we're not going to do that in this course. I just want to say how they solved the problem, the Kaminsky problem, and the answer is they haven't. Or if you want to be more friendly, they kind of made it harder for the attackers. But the fix is a kludge. Okay, so what they addressed is the problem that the attacker has to guess the right query ID. And guessing the right query ID is complicated with a 16-bit number, but still doable, right? So 16-bit, you have to perhaps send a lot of replies, but eventually you'll get it right. So what they've done, and it really is a kludge, is they made this number bigger. Okay, so it becomes harder to guess it correctly. It doesn't solve the problem, but it makes it harder. So if you go from a 16-bit number to a 32-bit number, guessing that correctly takes so many packets that the attack becomes impractical. However, this is not so easy to do, because making this query ID larger will break many applications across the internet. Okay, so all of these installations that are using this and assuming that the query ID is only 16 bits are going to break if you make it a larger number. So how to solve this? You cannot just make it bigger. What they've done instead is is clever, although it's not very elegant. They've increased the size of the randomness, so in other words, conceptually, the size of the random number that the attacker has to guess, without increasing the size of the query ID, by also making the port number random. So they randomize not just the query ID, but also the port number. And this increases essentially the number that the size of the number that the attacker has to guess correctly. It's a kludge, but it's somewhat pragmatic. It's much more complicated now to pull off this attack. Okay, so far we've looked at DNS attacks and spoofing at the UDP level. The next thing we're going to look at is a much more complicated trick, and that is, how do we do spoofing and hijacking for TCP?